When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in 1945, humanity hoped it had endured the last great conflict. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and the world stood at a crossroads between peace and power. But the ashes of that war gave birth to another, a colder, quieter struggle, fought not with armies across open fields, but through politics, ideology, and fear. The victors of the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union, emerged as superpowers. Their alliance had been built on necessity, not trust. Now they faced each other across an invisible line dividing the world. Democracy on one side, communism on the other. This confrontation became known as the Cold War, and at its center, a small nation in Southeast Asia would become the testing ground of both ideologies. That nation was Vietnam. For the United States, Vietnam was a distant land of rice paddies and jungles. For its people, it was home, a place that had already endured decades of colonial rule and war. Yet, it would soon become the stage for one of the most devastating and controversial conflicts in modern history, the Vietnam War. A war that would divide families, nations, and the conscience of humanity itself. Vietnam's struggle began long before American soldiers set foot on its soil. For nearly a century, it was part of French Indochina, ruled by a foreign power that exploited its resources and its people. But beneath that control grew a movement, a yearning for freedom that no empire could extinguish. Among those who fought for independence was Ho Chi Minh, a nationalist and communist who spent years abroad studying revolutionary ideas. When the Second World War ended, and Japan, which had briefly occupied Vietnam, was defeated, Ho saw his moment. On September 2nd, 1945, in Hanoi's Dien Square, he proclaimed the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, declaring independence from both Japan and France. His words echoed through the crowd. All men are created equal. The Creator has given us certain inviolable rights: life, liberty, and happiness. But the dream of freedom quickly met the realities of empire. France refused to let go. War broke out, the First Indochina War, pitting Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces against the French army. The fighting was brutal. Villages were burned, jungles bombed, and rivers ran red. But in 1954, after 8 long years, the Vietnamese delivered a stunning defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The French stronghold fell after 56 days of siege. France's colonial rule in Asia was over. At the Geneva Conference later that year, world powers met to decide Vietnam's fate. The country was divided along the 17th parallel. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh and his communists, and the South, ruled by Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist backed by the United States. What was meant as a temporary line would soon become a permanent scar. For the United States, Vietnam was not just a country. It was a symbol in a global chess game. American leaders believed that if one nation in Asia fell to communism, others would follow. Like a row of dominoes. This became the foundation of U.S. policy, the Domino Theory. President Dwight David Eisenhower and later John Fitzgerald Kennedy sent military advisors to support South Vietnam. Their goal was to build a stable, democratic government and stop the spread of communism. But corruption plagued the South Vietnamese regime. Its leader, Dien, was authoritarian and unpopular, alienating his own people through religious persecution and political repression. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh built a disciplined army and a loyal network of guerrillas known as the Viet Cong. They began infiltrating the south, attacking government outposts, ambushing convoys, and winning support from peasants who saw them as liberators. The conflict escalated quickly. In 1964, after a reported attack on U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, President Lyndon Baines Johnson asked Congress for permission to use full military force. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed, and America's longest war had begun. What started as limited support transformed into a massive military commitment. By 1968, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were in Vietnam. Helicopters filled the skies. Napalm and defoliants scorched the jungles. The war had arrived in full force. Vietnam was a war unlike any other. It was not fought over cities or front lines, but in dense jungles, swamps, and mountains where every shadow could hide the enemy. The U.S. military was powerful, armed with helicopters, tanks, and air superiority. But they were fighting an enemy they could not see. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, traps, and tunnels stretching hundreds of miles beneath the earth. They struck at night, vanished by dawn, and turned every village into a potential battlefield. To counter them, America launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Yet, despite millions of tons of bombs, the will of the Vietnamese people did not break. The land itself became a weapon. Jungles were destroyed with Agent Orange, rivers poisoned, crops burned. But instead of crushing resistance, these tactics fueled hatred and despair. For the soldiers on the ground, American, South Vietnamese, and Viet Cong alike, Vietnam became a living nightmare, a place of mud, fear, and endless loss. In early 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Tet, the world witnessed a turning point. In a surprise move, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong launched a coordinated assault across more than 100 South Vietnamese cities and bases. Explosions rocked Saigon. Fighting raged in Hue, one of Vietnam's oldest cities. Even the U.S. Embassy came under attack. Though the offensive was eventually repelled, it shattered the illusion that America was winning the war. Television cameras brought the horror home. The smoke, the chaos, the despair. Millions of Americans watched in disbelief as journalists reported from burning streets and bloodied villages. The war was no longer distant. It was in their living rooms. Public support collapsed. Protests erupted across universities. The American people began to question not only the war, but the government itself. President Johnson, worn down and defeated, announced he would not seek re-election. The war had broken not only Vietnam, but the spirit of a nation that once believed it could do no wrong. By the late 1960s, the United States was divided like never before. The Vietnam War had torn through the fabric of American society. Students protested in the streets. Parents mourned their sons. Veterans returned home to indifference, not honor. For the first time, Americans openly defied their leaders. The phrase credibility gap was born, a growing distrust between what the government said and what the people saw. In 1970, the war expanded into Cambodia, sparking more outrage. At Kent State University, 4 unarmed students were shot dead by National Guardsmen during a protest, a tragic symbol of a nation at war with itself. Music, art, and culture reflected the pain. Songs like Fortunate Son and Blowin' in the Wind became anthems of dissent. The United States was fighting 2 wars, one abroad and one at home. By the early 1970s, America's will to fight had faded. Under President Richard Nixon, U.S. forces began to withdraw, handing over combat to the South Vietnamese Army, a policy called Vietnamization. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, and American troops finally left Vietnam. But peace was fragile. Without U.S. support, South Vietnam crumbled under the renewed assault of the North. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. The city fell. The image of helicopters evacuating Americans from the embassy rooftop became an enduring symbol of defeat. The Vietnam War was over. The cost, beyond measure. When the war ended, the world exhaled, but peace brought no joy. Over 58,000 Americans, more than 3 million Vietnamese, and countless Cambodians and Laotians were dead. Entire landscapes were poisoned by chemicals, and generations would bear the scars. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, but it was a victory paid in blood and sorrow. The nation faced hunger, poverty, and isolation for years to come. For American veterans, the return home was hollow. Many were met not with gratitude, but with silence and misunderstanding. The war had changed them and their country forever. Decades have passed. Vietnam has risen from the ashes. The jungles once burned by war now bloom with life. Cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City pulse with energy and hope. But the lessons of Vietnam endure. It was a war that questioned power, morality, and purpose. A reminder that military might cannot win the hearts of people, and that understanding is as powerful a weapon as any gun. The Vietnam War was not merely a conflict between nations. It was a mirror, reflecting the fears, ambitions, and contradictions of humanity itself. The rivers of Vietnam still flow, calm, patient, eternal. And in their reflection lies a truth carved in history, that every war may end, but its echoes never fade. Peace once broken demands generations to heal.